Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about the youth climate training, talking about climate change. This picture was taken during one of the Apollo missions in 1972. This is the first climate picture that we have of the Earth. This shows that we're all connected and that we all have an impact on the Earth. The sky is vast and limitless. Expanse, and that there's only a thin layer of atmosphere covering the Earth.
Let's begin with the question, what is the climate crisis? Today we will learn what most adults don't, so you'll be able to teach them. There's two cycles called the natural cycle and the unnatural cycle. The natural cycle is when we breathe out carbon dioxide, CO2 for short, and the trees breathe them in, and then it helps them grow and produce food, and then they release oxygen, which helps us breathe. Then there's the unnatural cycle, where when we dig out fossil fuels and gasoline and burn them, which is not good for the earth, and it pollutes it and makes people and trees sick.
Okay, the greenhouse effect. The atmosphere is basically a blanket around the Earth, and it's a very thin layer. The sun shines its rays onto the Earth and stays in the atmosphere to keep us warm and not too hot but not too cold, and it takes out some of the rays. The atmosphere has greenhouse gas, which are made up of CO2, water vapor, and methane. But as of 2 centuries ago till now, the atmosphere got too thick, so it's basically making the whole world too warm and melting glaciers and trapping pollution.
Okay, so on this map is a picture of the United States and the carbon dioxide is mostly in China, because that's where the biggest factories are and where we get most of our stuff. Everything's made in China, and so because of all those big factories, there's a lot of pollution that's going into the air and is ruining our atmosphere. And if we were to cut down some of the use of the factories, and even at our own homes, we could shut off lights that we aren't using, and then we could create a better environment for our future years or even decades.
And then slightly different from that last graph, which was showing, slightly different from that last graph, which was showing overall CO2 emissions. This graph is carbon footprint per person. So we can see how China used to have a really big circle. It's slightly smaller now just because of how massive the population is there. What we see most directly is that in North America actually has some of the largest per person carbon footprints, because in North America it constitutes only about 5% of our global population, but is responsible for about 20% of the CO2 emissions. And on this graph we see 15 nations that are responsible for 80% of current emissions. So only the top 15 nations out of 195 supply 80% of the current emissions.
Wow.
And now we're going to look a little bit about the implications of those emissions. So here, this is a picture, a satellite image from 1980, and it shows kind of the North Pole of the Earth. And then we see, it's a little hard to see, but there's a little bit of a color difference. There are two different types of ice. On this left-hand side that's slightly whiter, we have Arctic ice, and then on the right-hand side there's Greenland ice. And the important distinction between these is that the Arctic ice cap is floating on the water. So if that amount of ice were to melt, it wouldn't actually increase the sea level that much because it's already in the water. However, the Greenland ice is lying on top of a body of land. So if that ice were to melt, it would run off into the ocean and cause sea levels to rise by about 7 meters, which would be extremely dangerous to especially coastal regions and lower elevations. And remember, that was a picture from 1980, and this is a picture from 2012, where you see that about a third of the Arctic ice cap has already melted off. And while that isn't dangerous for the sea level rising, there are more dangerous implications later on that we'll look at. And we see that the Greenland ice has yet to melt. But given another average change of about 4 degrees hotter globally, we'll see that these ice sheets will start to melt, and we'll see a really, really dangerous increase in global water level.
Absolutely. So there's this thing called reflectivity potential, and it goes into this idea of how much snow or ice is on the Arctic Circle or in Greenland. So when this is a picture of 1980, as we were looking at earlier, and you can see there's a lot of snow and ice, and what that lets it happen is that rays coming from the sun, a lot of them will reflect off back into outer space. So it's kind of a cooling process where you have sun and light coming in, and then the heat, actually, most of it radiates outwards back into space, causing the temperature to cool. However, when you get to 2012, just a 30-year difference, by the way, you can see a lot of the ice in the Arctic Circle has already melted. And what that results in is that when the sunlight and the heat come in, they don't reflect as much off the snow, but instead they get absorbed into the water. And water will actually absorb 90% more heat and light than snow will. And this will cause a lot of, as Ryan was talking about, you can start to see that even though the Greenland ice hasn't melted yet, what will happen is that if there's a greater degrees Celsius temperature change, like 4 degrees, you'll start to see that increase the sea levels a lot, which can be very damaging to the climate and to the world.
So as you can see, the temperature has been going up from -0.2 in 1880 to 400 in 2016. And that is not good for our environment. As you can see, the white line, which is the CO2 concentration, has been going up, and we need to try to get it back down. So right here, our ppm, which is at 410, and we need to get it back down to 350, because that where we're at right now is dangerous, and our goal is to get it back to 250 and 1 degree Celsius. So right here, our carbon dioxide has been going up over the past few years, and this is the largest source of CO2 that we've had over the years. So the green line says that if we had cut our fossil fuel usage down to 0 by 2010, that which was a long time ago, everything would have gone back to normal, or global warming would be less of an issue. The purple line says that if everything isn't fixed by 2030, that if everything isn't fixed by, if fossil fuel usage isn't cut down to 0 by 2030, that it would cause a long-lasting, like 200 years of climate problems.
the production of the man-made CO2 has increased in the last 100 years, and it's been affecting the Earth negatively. In 1948, the glacier in Switzerland was full. By 2002, it was dwindled a little bit, and by 2011, it's completely gone. The only thing that's left is a flicker.
The heat is causing many droughts worldwide, including the U.S. This slide shows that just this summer, Oregon had a very severe drought with very little water left. And our neighbor state, California, also had a very severe drought, and many homes were left with no water because their wells were all dried up. In 2017, we had the Eagle Creek fire. Because of the droughts, there are these wildfires, and these wildfires destroy many homes, lives, and forests.
100 years ago, there has been only one fire in California, and since the 2000s, there has been many more than just one. This is what it looks like before the fire, and this is what it looks like after the fire.
There is a winery that is in Santa Rosa, which is in Napa Valley. There was a fire, and this is what it looked like before the fire, and this is what it looked like.
Along with fires, global warming can also, along with fires and droughts, global warming can also bring tsunamis and floods. This is very dangerous for people who live in the beach or along any coastline. This is the city of Venice, Italy. It had this is it before the flood, and this is it after the flood. You can see the water, that there was no water before, and now there is an increasing amount of water. Though these hazards are very big, there are things that we can do to stop them. But if we don't do them now, the global warming problem might get worse.
The reason why it's flooding is because warm air. The reason why it's flooding is because warm air can contain more moisture than cold air. So with carbon dioxide covering up the atmosphere, then greenhouse gases will stay in the greenhouse gases will cover up the atmosphere, and it's warmer and it will cause more floods. Specifically in one city, it's called Meadow, Texas. It had 5 feet worth of rain during one storm. That's a problem specifically for islands such as the Marshall Islands and low-lying areas, because it's flooding and it's just going to cover up all the islands until there's not much. So we need to change that.
In some communities are supposed to take care of their water. And they do not take care of it to where the water gets infected, and when people drink it, it's not going to be healthy for them to drink out of it. Someone called Pope the greatest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the forest. As you can see, this person right here named Foxy lives in this tree in Beaverton. Her house is flooded. Can you imagine living like that? And you might just think that global warming is only affecting poor and poor countries. But it is also affecting wealthy countries, including Britain. As you can see, there is also a blue line, and that blue line is where the shore should be ending from the ice melting.
Okay, so now we'll see what the effects of the rising sea levels could be on a state in the United States called Florida. And this is in 2007. And if you fast forward 100 years, this is what it could look like if the sea levels continue to rise at the rate that they are. And it is common to think, it's common for people to think that this climate crisis isn't real or it's a hoax or whatever, but as you can see from this picture and picture before, that this is truly a real problem that is occurring in our Earth. And whether that be sea level rising or the temperature going up, there needs to be action taken in order to preserve our world as long as we can.
Recently, the Marshall Islands became very famous because they got very, very severely flooded, and almost everything was destroyed, as you can see here in this picture. And there's nothing the government can really do because they're put on the spot. It's a very difficult situation, and almost all the people are suffering because of this. And due to this reasoning, the government is not giving any of the people affected a refugee status. And as a result, they are just stuck on the Marshall Islands with almost nothing to go after. And it's estimated in 2014 there were 19.4 million of these people around the world suffering due to a climate change-induced natural disaster like flooding in the Marshall Islands. In addition, this major flood was caused by a slow progression of sea level rise over time, combined with a very high tide during the month. As you can see, the Marshall Islands aren't one of the major producers of carbon dioxide in the world, but they are the ones that are suffering. So it just goes to show that climate change is not a just issue, and you need to try to fight to make sure that even though the US and China and other countries like that are the ones producing carbon dioxide, we're not suffering, but instead we're just giving it all to the poor countries. And we need to make sure that A, we're trying to reduce all of these lives that are being lost to the flooding, and B, trying to make sure that the poorer countries who don't have as strong of an infrastructure are able to survive longer. And in this next slide, we can see that these people don't have a home to go in their own country, so they're forced to become a refugee and just go to a different country. These people in particular are going from North Africa to Europe, and you may be wondering, how does climate change directly link to refuge? And like I said, it could be that their home was destroyed in a disaster, but another common thing is water abundance. And we all know that we like to consume fresh water because salt water is too salty for us. So when glaciers are melting because of global warming, they are getting mixed in with the salty water and we are losing that water. Thus, some people might be in a difficult spot because they cannot consume enough fresh water, but instead just have no water at all.
We've heard all these series of unfortunate events. The big question we have is,
how can this stop? How can we help stop climate change? We can empower ourselves and other people to reduce greenhouse gas emissions such as methane and carbon, and we can reduce our use of CO2. We can't solve a problematic system using the same problematic system. We need to change. And if we change our system, then that will make a change to the results. This is the first step, coming here to the YAE, or the Youth Acting of Our Earth. Being here, we can all advocate for our future and our Earth.
These are some famous people that you might recognize, and these people have taken action into trying to make a difference for climate change. And all it takes is one person, and you can start a whole movement. Like these people did. They started a movement.
So after all the training is done, and you come YAE. Why would you leave? You can get other people engaged by helping train other members in training, or making or doing monthly meetings with groups of people in nature, or trying to get your city to go 100% clean and reusable energy.
And now some of you have seen why it says Vogue on that side, huh? So you have to talk to us about it later. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, no, it's good.
So, well, this is a really difficult and depressing issue. It seems like there's a lot of work left for us to do. The good news is that we have everything that we need to do it if we just take that action. So there's tons of technologies that are getting more and more efficient and less expensive by the day, like solar panels and like wind turbines that can help us be CO2 by cutting down on our use of fossil fuels or our, the thing about that is that you need to remember that they are there and not lose hope when you hear lies from certain other media sources in opposition that say that it's not real, because it is, and we can do the work if we want to.
Adults need help making lifestyle choices for the kids. For example, there's families in Seattle protested for warning signs on hazardous testing. You can bring your own cup. You can ask your server help the environment?
As you might know, CO2. There's like specific ways like cars and stuff like that, but there's also ways that you could emit it without even knowing, such as like sending an email, such as the attachment, or even eating beef, or going on an airplane or anything, honestly. So, in order to cut that down, you could instead of buying clothes every single time for an occasion, you could borrow somebody else's clothes or learn how to mend your own, or you buy used instead of new clothes every single time. And if you wanted to go on a vacation on an airplane instead of to exchange for that greenhouse usage, you could cut down in the weeks before on the weeks before of your flight.
So methane is another greenhouse gas that is more dangerous and powerful than CO2. A large portion of methane comes from cows and when they eat like soy and corn. So one way we can cut down on that number is by having them grass fed, which will just be another way to help the environment.
Another way you can help the environment is by planting trees and taking part in the act of planting trees. Because what a tree does is it takes in CO2 and heat, and it gives out healthy oxygen. And as you know, we all breathe oxygen, and it is just a good way it's a good way to take in CO2 and release oxygen in a healthy way. Another thing you can do is fundraise for climate work, whether that be fundraising money to plant and take care of trees, or you can also take part in a app called Ecosia, where you download it and basically they plant a tree in your path.
Okay, one of the really important things you can do to help support lowering our carbon emissions and to help reduce the effects of climate change is to support legislation, especially things like the Green New Deal and the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which support movements to tax large corporations who put out massive amounts of CO2 as a disincentive for those corporations so that they stop putting out as much carbon, and also so that that money can go back to impoverished communities and to community building and to help fight against climate change. One of the simplest ways to help with global climate change is actually to reduce the amount of food you waste. And that may sound really simple, so I encourage you guys to all try it. But you may be thinking, how does cutting down how much food I waste even impact the global climate change? And you have to remember that your food doesn't just magically appear on the shelf at the grocery store. Someone had to farm that in probably Mississippi or Alabama or some other place like that where they grow whatever food you want. And they had to spend time on irrigating it, planting it, taking it, and then they had to transport it all the way to the grocery store. So by wasting your food, you are most likely going to end up wasting all the carbon emissions that came with that food. And it is estimated on average, the average American wastes 40% of their food. So that means about half the stuff someone buys at the grocery store will just end up in the garbage, meaning half the emissions that were used to make that piece of food are being wasted for absolutely no reason.
You can make a big contribution by eating less meat and eating more fruits and vegetables. As this does
several theories shows that eating the foods that are more healthier for Earth is also more healthy for our bodies. So, by supporting local farms and farmers, you could read Michael Pollan's of Board's Dilemma. It's a good way to start.
All right, so just continuing to talk about this idea of what can I do, or what is something we as a society or as a world can do to prevent climate change and promote green things. And so one thing that we can do is, we've had a lot of modern industrialization in the last few decades, and while that is prevalent throughout the entire world, there are a lot of different indigenous tribes that exist, and they still, practice the original ways of sustainability, and I think we can really gain some inspiration or talk with these tribes to see what are their, farming practices, their agricultural, where do they get their food, how does that help, how does that contribute well to the earth as opposed to detracting from it, and I think that's a very important thing to look forward to. All right, and these are two very important things. First of all is buy less. We're very fortunate and we have a lot of things, and so on occasion we do buy more than we need, and while that's okay to a certain extent, it's good to try and minimize that and look and see where can I save as much as I can. Another thing that's very important is to buy consciously. Try and think about and do your research about where's my food coming from. Where will it go after maybe if there's waste or something, is it going towards, compost, or is it being used in a bad way? And just thinking about how these things contribute to society and to the earth is really important for thinking about the effects of climate change in the future. And I think that's something that we should pay more attention to.
So the Kelsey Juliana Powell versus United States is a lawsuit where 21 youth are suing the federal government so they can get more attention onto the climate crisis. And so basically this lawsuit hasn't yet been taken to trial, but it has already went to the upper court, the Ninth Circuit Court, and at least twice to the Supreme Court. And there will be a hearing June 4th, 2019 in Portland, Oregon in the Ninth Circuit Court. So the judicial branch will take the executive branch responsible for any unconstitutional acts they take, which might harm our citizens, which might be harmful to the citizens. And so, some things we can use from the Constitution to protect our rights for this climate crisis is the public trust doctrine, the Fifth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. And so, those 21 youths I was talking about proposed the National Climate Recovery Plan. And so this plan is basically helping with emission reduction and carbon sequestration. So basically this will help with putting back carbon dioxide or carbon back into our soil and our trees, so we can help with reforestation and soil revitalization. And so basically on October 29th, 2018, when the trial was supposed to begin, thousands of people came together to do rallies and other events and with those 21 youth to protest against the climate crisis. And so the Kelsey Juliana trial, or that lawsuit isn't the only lawsuit that went for like changes. For example, there was the Brown versus Board of Education, where they were against segregation in schools, and so they mandated and did an implementation like to overrule that. And so with this like helped support their idea of the national climate recovery plan, and so to mandate that.
Okay, here are some of the things that we can do as students. We can write essays or do presentations or write letters about climate change, and that just gives us more and more practice on the topic, so we can be more informed and educate our peers and our teachers and our principals about the topic. And also, it is important to create conversations about climate change, because the more people that are informed on the topic, the better it is for this whole movement, because we want more people to be aware of what is going on in our Earth, and the more people that are aware, the more possibility that they want to be advocates just like us. And also, if you get the opportunity, it's also good to talk to the media and other media outlets, because they have very big platforms, and if you get your voice on one of those platforms, you can spread your message like wherever like you want it to go.
So right now, as kids, we can't vote, so we don't have a voice in that sense. We do have a voice in the sense that we can speak to people and we can speak about some things that are like really important to us. And so like if you tell people in your life and in your family about climate change, you can influence them and you can help them understand why it's so important. And you can also speak out to the public, and people will listen, because if like a kid is willing to like come up and talk about like climate change and how they care so much about it, then it's kind of, it's like a statement really, and people will listen to that. And then the other important thing to do is to talk to your elected officials and your legislators, and persuade them to support bills and legislation that will help stop carbon emissions and help reduce the effects of climate change, because change needs to happen on all levels, because if our systems aren't working in our favor, then we're never going to be able to make the change with just personal choices.
There are millions ways that we can help support this movement by talking to people in our world or community that make important decisions for us, or to take political action, and such as doing rallies and marches. We can to show our to show our sorry, to show and to show our skill sets and our creativity.
And your sense of humor is very important too.
To show and express our skill sets and creativity, we can do art, and we can make posters. We can make signs for our marches, and once we're done with them, we can put them up on our windowsill. We can also make shirts that have important slogans and stuff, and give them out in our community. You can go with a group of friends that actually want to learn or know about climate change, and you guys can go
Or you can make a club, and in that club you can have meetings to discuss about climate change, or make activities like watching a movie about climate change.
One of the many benefits of this work is the amount of friends you make. You could, from international conferences or Skype or talking through Instagram or Messenger, you would make a lot of friends and make a difference in the world. Also, marches and rallies. Use your voice, your votes, and make the right choices to fight the climate crisis. Speak truth to power like your world depends on it. Because your world does depend on it. Make the right choices.
So one thing to consider is that our families are our homes and our communities and they're really important to us. And because of climate change and climate refugees, there's a lot of young kids who are in need of a family or just in need in general. And it's important to just consider that and maybe welcome one into your family by adopting them. And overall, we've talked about climate change is a really difficult issue, but we've talked about a lot of solutions and a lot of things you could do going forward. So go forward with optimism and not pessimism, and have fun and do good work. And does anyone have any questions? Thank you for being here today.
I think we need a seriously loud round of applause. You guys are so amazing.